Hey Braylon, so the quiz that you're having issues with is over two poems by the author or poet William Butler Yeats, and one is Sailing to Byzantium, the other is The Second Coming. So I want to talk just quickly about each poem. We're only going to look at about a stanza of each one, and I'm going to teach you how to understand. Poetry can be difficult, especially something like Yeats that has some archaic language and syntactical structure, so how they put the sentence together that we don't see in modern writing. So I want to make sure that you understand how to read it and how to understand it. Then that's going to be easier for you to answer the questions. Then we're going to look at a question from each poem that you missed and go over why you missed it, how to come up with the right answers when you're answering questions about poetry, and then that should help you when you retake the quiz. So let's look at Sailing to Byzantium first. A couple of things when we read poetry. I say always read it twice. I tell my students at least twice. That's the minimum. Read it first. Just read through it, just at face value. The second time as you read through it, you're going to read through to see what almost always there is metaphorical language. Most of the time in poetry, the words don't just mean what they say they are. They stand for something else. So metaphor, which you would have talked about and learned about in earlier classes, English classes. So, and then try to understand what the author is trying to say through that metaphor or through other devices, conflict, contrast, similes, anything like that. The first element that I teach students about when we read poetry, and it's one reason why sometimes, especially in Shakespeare, but also in any poetry, that students have a hard time reading and understanding, is because we read line by line for some reason, where we are taught, or we read poetry. So let's say we were to read this line: "That is no country for old men, the young." Well, that doesn't really make sense because that's not what the poet meant. There's an element, you don't really have to know this, but it's called enjambment. It's a poetic device. And it means where a line ends, the line ends here, but the thought actually goes down to the bottom. So the way to the next line. So the way I teach my students to read poetry is with punctuation. So you need to stop, just like you would read a novel, you need to stop where the punctuation is, and that's going to help you understand a little bit easier. Okay, so I had to go over that first. So let's read this stanza, and then let's try to decide what he's saying, and then let's look at the question you missed with this stanza. Sailing to Byzantium by William Butler Yeats. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations. At their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. Okay, so we've read it once. I'm not going to read it again just so this video isn't very long, but I would just try to see, okay, what are my first thoughts? What's happening in this stanza? And then I would read it again out loud. I'm not going to do that for purposes of this video. And then I would say, okay, that is no country for old men. So I have old men here. I have talking about dying generations. Here I have the contrast of the young and the old. So I know somewhere we're talking about aging and talking about someone who's either been on a journey or going on a journey, who's been on a journey. Those who are starting are the young. Those who are ending are those who are old. He's saying where he is right now is no country or no place for someone who is aging or dying. The dying generations, they commend, they appreciate whatever is born and dies, but we have to look caught in that sensual music. Who's caught in the sensual music? Probably the young, because they're in one another's arms. There's birds, everything's around them, but the dying Sorry, I had technical issues. But the dying generation, those who are older in society, they are left, they're neglected, okay, by the young. They have unaging intellect. They have something to give to society. They have something that is worth something. But instead, the those who are young are caught in sensual pleasures or things that may not mean much at the end, but because they're young and they're caught up in the pleasures of the day and those that they're with, they are not able to see what the older generation has to give. Okay, so let's go to your question you missed. You missed number 1 that asks, so we're talking about conflict. It says there's conflict between. What is the conflict between in these 2 lines? Okay, so we just went over what we think that stanza means. This says, in the following lines from Sailing to Byzantium, caught in that sensual music all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. So we said the young are caught up, they are neglecting the older generation. And what did the older generation have to teach them? That you should do what? You should focus on or look at intellect. What does intellect connect with in this answer? If I really break it down, now if I'm just reading the poem and I don't break down the lines and I don't try to analyze, it could be anything. It could be life and death, because you see aging and you see those who are young. Those who are young are in the present, the older are the past. But is that what these 2 lines, if I go back and analyze those lines in the poem, if I look at that stanza and analyze each line to what the author is trying to convey, then he's saying there's a conflict between the young who are caught up in sensuality and the pleasure that you get from sensual connection, or the pleasure you get from lying out in the sun with the birds above you and just whatever feels good, compared to what those who are older or aging can teach about pursuing things intellectual, or would that be pursuits not with the body and physical pleasure, but the mind. Okay, so I've kind of given you that answer if you think about it, but I want you have to break down each question, and you have to break down the lines of the poem and make sure you're understanding what the stanza is saying. Okay, so go back. I've broken down the first stanza of Sailing to Byzantium. When you have questions from the other stanzas, go read with enjambment so you understand what the lines are saying. Make sure you think about what the lines are saying for face value, and then break them down and say, what is the metaphor here? What is Yeats trying to say through the lines of his poem? And then you can better answer the questions. Okay, now let's go to the second coming. Let's just look at the first line. We're actually going to look at the second stanza of the end, because I'm going to focus on the piece that goes with the question you missed. But then if you think about how we answer and look at these lines, that will help you with any question about the poem. Okay, so we want to look at the question first. In the second coming, what is symbolized? So we have symbolism by the rough beast of line 21. That means rough beast does not mean an actual beast. It means he is meaning it to stand for something else that he considers to be a beast or something that's attacking. But what is that thing? We have to figure out. Okay, so let's go to the poem. Let's just look. That line is here. And what rough beast? Its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Now, if you just read that and quickly picked one because you have some answers here. Oh, Bethlehem. Who's born? Bethlehem. Jesus Christ. So maybe it's Christ. Let me just pick one. He talks about nature some. But we have to break it down. You have to look at it individually and figure out what it is he's talking about. So let's go up and quickly look. He has an extended metaphor because he's talking about he is talking about nature. He talks about the second coming is at hand. But what is it? Let's read the lines. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reels shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Okay, so we've read the second stanza, and we can't answer our question without going back up to the first stanza. So when we go back up, which you would have had to answer the earlier questions, quickly, turning and turning in the widening ire, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. So a falcon would be flying up high and can see the world as a whole. Okay, and it can't hear the falconer who would be its master or have control. It can't hear, it's just looking. Things fall apart, so the world falls apart. The center cannot hold. It's like the moral compass or the center of the world of society is falling apart. Anarchy is loosed upon the world, so rebellion, fighting is loosed upon the world, so there's fighting happening. Innocence is drowned, so those who are innocent, they lose their innocence. There's no conviction, so the world he sees is losing its morals or its conviction of what is right and wrong. And those who, so that's the best, like the best people, they lack that, they lose that, and the worst people are full of passionate intensity. They have passion for what it is, but they are bad. So we have juxtaposition here, and antithesis. We have the best who are losing that best part of them, and the worst who are passionate about being the worst, about having the worst views. So we're looking at society here, and we have to look at this first stanza to figure that out. Then we go to our second stanza that we talked about, and for 20 centuries, we've looking at our past, the second coming. Surely there's going to be something that comes and saves us from this. Surely we're at the point he is seeing at this time, his time, all this issues in society. Surely the second coming is at hand. Someone's coming to save us. But what rough beast? There's something here that is, what is the thing that is the beast? What is the thing that is hurting society? Well, if we go back up to the first stanza, is it nature that's hurting society? Is it baseless fears? Is Christ coming? Is that the rough beast? No, it's something that's threatening. And what are those things that are threatening? It's anarchy. It's the loss of innocence. It's those who would hold truths to be like they uphold truth are losing their conviction, and the worst. These are the things. What are those? Those are all threats to society. Okay, so make sure when you're answering the questions, these all make sense if you don't break the poem down. I was trying to just look at the second stanza, but that doesn't really work in a question like that. You have to go back. So before you answer the questions, I would look at both poems and analyze and break them down. Okay, let me know if you need a Zoom lesson on this, and we need to go over the poems in entirety together to really understand them before you take the quiz again. But try those things first, and how I asked you to break them down in relation to the questions you're looking at, and I hope you should do better on the quizzes. Okay, good luck.